Welcome to Think Again. I'm pleased to be back here with my colleague Abdullah Antepli. And today, our special guest, Rabbi Daniel Greyber, who leads the Bethel congregation right off of East Campus, for those of you who are interested. And I'm also proud to say that Rabbi Greyber is my rabbi and Bethel my congregation.
He's my rabbi.
And except you go more than I do, Abdullah, but don't say that in front of Rabbi Greyber.
I have a better attendance as a Muslim than a Jewish Eric Miller.
But that's a conversation for another day. But anyway, really pleased to be having this conversation, and maybe just start, Rabbi Greyber, with a little bit of a biographical background of how you got to Durham, North Carolina, and your journey to becoming a rabbi. And then we can focus in on important moments of change of heart and mind for you.
So first of all, thank you for having me. You are both beloved friends and colleagues, and I'm grateful for your presence in my life. How did I become, since this is, we have a number of Duke undergrads who are listening, I'll tell you a story. When I did not grow up keeping kosher or sort of very engaged in the Jewish community at all. I was a competitive swimmer. And when I went off to UC Berkeley, where one of Abdullah's children has been. And when I went to college, I was the youngest child, and my mom put a book into one of my bags for me to read at some point during my freshman year. It was a book that she had just read as she was becoming an empty nester. And it was written by Rabbi Harold Kushner, who is most famous for having written a book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Many people are familiar with. He also wrote a book called When All You've Ever Wanted Isn't Enough. And it is a story, it begins with a story about a man who calls Rabbi Kushner and says, I need to see you, very soon. And Rabbi Kushner says, I can see you tomorrow morning. Is that okay? And he says, sure. And he comes into the office and he looks exhausted. It's clear he hasn't been sleeping very much, if at all. And he says, tell me what's going on. And the man tells Rabbi Kushner this story that 2 weeks ago there was a man in his office who died suddenly of a heart attack. He had a wife and he had 4 children, and everybody in the office was torn up about this. And the man had told Rabbi Kushner, I haven't slept in 3 days. And Rabbi Kushner, heard the whole story, and he came back to him and he said, it's a terrible story. I know how disturbing something like that is. Can you tell me, is there something that happened 3 days ago? Why haven't you slept in 3 days? And he said, yeah, this is what I wanted to tell you. 3 days ago, I was back in my office, and I walked by that man's office, and there was another man in his office sitting at his desk, using his computer and going through his files. And what this man realized is that, his friend who had died of a heart attack had been replaced. And he said to Rabbi Kushner, at that moment, I felt like my life is like a stone that you throw into a pond and it makes some ripples, but then it sinks to the bottom and is swallowed up, and it is as if it never was. And he said, Rabbi Kushner, I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid that I'm living and I have no idea what my life means. And Rabbi Kushner opens the book with this story because his book is ultimately about how do you live a life of significance? How do you live a life that pays attention to the question of what is the purpose of why you're here? And he ultimately is sort of speaking to people who go through midlife crises, who wake up 20 years after they graduate from college and they have a spouse and they have a minivan and they have 2.5 children and the American dream. By the way, I'm married and I have 3 children and I have a minivan. So all of this has happened to me. But Rabbi Kushner is writing this book for people who are waking up and they're realizing I need to figure this out. And I want to be very clear. I read this when I was a freshman. I did not drop off of the swim team. or change my life radically, but the book planted a seed within me that really germinated all through college. And when I graduated college, I didn't want to get a job, not because I was lazy, but because I was really afraid that if I just got a job in the corporate world, that it was like getting on this train that I was not going to be able to get off of. And that 20 years later, I was going to end up in Rabbi Kushner's office, sort of trying to figure out, okay, I have these things, but what does my life mean? And so when as I got closer to the end of college, I ended up transferring to Northwestern and finishing up my swimming career there. And as I did, I didn't go and get a job. I ended up, I'm Jewish and had grown up with a little bit of exposure to Judaism. I went to the Maccabeah Games in Israel, which is a Jewish sports competition. And I found within Judaism, not the answers. I don't think that any tradition has a monopoly on answers, but I found that Judaism sort of very richly answers those questions of how do you live a life of meaning. And eventually that led me to go into rabbinical school and to decide to be a rabbi.
What would you have said to me at 18 if I had said to you, you're going to be the leader of a conservative congregation at this age? What would you have
I would
said?
have laughed. I would have laughed like I am. And by the way, what most of my friends would have said the same thing.
No way.
Correct. Yeah.
Our students should note that. Our students should note that that life takes paths they can't possibly imagine at this moment.
Right. You mean if somebody had come up to me at a fraternity party and told me I was going to be a rabbi someday? Yeah, that would have been surprising.
Yeah, you would have waited for the punchline.
I want students to think that this was such an easy and fun process. Let's slow down and go a little bit deeper. What was that discernment like? You went to UC Berkeley, Northwestern, and then you wanted to be a clergy. I can only imagine the kind of internal and external struggles that you have gone through. Give us a language. What was that decision making like?
So another piece of the story I will say is that really impacted me was that when I was at Northwestern, I had a childhood friend, a friend from high school who went to Northwestern. I transferred, and he and I ended up rooming together. His name was Jay Rosen, and he was very sick with leukemia. He actually came out of remission my junior year, and ultimately he ended up dying a number of years later. And I think that his illness sharpened my focus and really put my life into perspective, that I should not expect that I was going to live forever, and pushed me to really take that question seriously, that was awakened in that book that my mom put in my bag. We are alive for a relatively short amount of time. In geologic time, we are alive for an instant. We walk through the world for very little time, and the question is, what does it mean, and how do you make your life mean something? And again, for me, I did come to a conclusion that was a religious question. I think there's a book, if you want to put this on your reading list, everybody, it's called The Denial of Death. It was written by Ernest Becker. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 1977, I think. Remarkable book, where he's not a religious person, but what he does is, I'll do this really quickly. He describes human beings, it's a very funny phrase, as angels with anuses. And what he means by that is that we are animals. We share a lot of things with lions and tigers and bears. We procreate, we eat, we defecate, we do all the creaturely things that animals do, but we're also angels in this. And what he means by that is that we have a sense that our life is also more important than just the physicality of our beings. And the title, The Denial of Death, he says that what human beings do is they construct systems of meaning to transcend our deaths, to transcend our physicality. But a lot of the time we do that in ways that don't really achieve those means or achieve those goals. So we try to have the best job, right? Because if, by the work that we do, we're going to make our lives meaningful. By the way, clergy are, fall into this trap a lot, okay? Because we're, that our work is in the synagogue business or the church business, or we try to, as artists, we try to create something that will outlast us. Also romantic relationships, right? All those times that you hear a song about the stars are in your eyes or the moonlight is in your hair, right? What we're trying to do is to say that the love that I feel for this person is transcendent. It helps me, it's something that is far beyond my own life. And the truth is that relationships are not only about the perfection of the other person, but a lot of the imperfection. That our jobs are, we are replaceable, as was the man in that story, and that, we could be the greatest artist or the greatest athlete or the greatest, produce the greatest thing, the greatest piece of music. And you know what, in 100,000 years, it's all going to be forgotten, right? And so Ernest Becker actually convinced me that even if religious systems are imperfect, they are at least speaking what he calls the language of ultimacy. They're sort of giving us a vocabulary for thinking about the ultimate purpose of our lives. And that was my own decision and discernment, as you said, Abdullah.
That's great. So I want to focus in now on, you deal with a large congregation, a growing congregation, a diverse congregation with lots of different viewpoints on spiritual matters, political matters, and you've dealt with some difficult decisions and areas where there have been disagreements in the congregation. And I wonder if you could share with our students some of those, one of those that might help us understand a change of heart or mind that you've had in a very particular way.
So when I was ordained as a rabbi, I began the first 9 years of my career as a rabbi was not in a congregation. It was as the director of a Jewish summer camp in the western region of the United States. It's called Camp Vermont, California. And because I was primarily working with kids and running the camp, it shielded me from a number of life cycle questions that come up in the life of a lived community. When I decided in 2010 that I was going to leave the camp and was interested in becoming a congregational rabbi, I interviewed for the position here at Bethel. And one of the questions that was asked as part of the process was, would you perform gay marriages? And when I answered that question, I'll say a couple of things. One, I do have a principled conviction that when the Jewish law doesn't exist sort of in a vacuum somewhere in hypotheticals, but that it lives as the lived experience between a rabbi and a living community. And I had not performed gay marriages before. And what I said to the community was that I can't promise that I will say yes, and I can't promise that I will say no, but that I need to be in the community before giving an answer to that question. The other piece of it is that when I answered the question more deeply, what ended up happening is I sort of spoke in abstractions about Jewish law. I think in some ways I was trying to demonstrate, it's an interview process, I was trying to demonstrate that I was knowledgeable about the way in which Jewish law understands all of these things. And by answering in abstractions, I ended up hurting some people with whom I was in conversation. Now, I didn't hear about that until later. I didn't know that I was, that I was hurting someone, but the community made a decision to nonetheless hire me. Enough things had gone well in the process. But when I came to the community, I think that was there was still some tenderness around that. Because I had spoken from a more theoretical place. And when I came to Bethel, I was, I got settled in and got to know people and was asked the question. And by someone, a gay couple who wanted me to perform their marriage. And that was for me a wonderful opportunity to share with the community what my decision would be, and also, which in the end was yes, and I can talk a little bit more about that, but also to try and take a moment to apologize and convey some deeper understanding to the community that I wasn't able to convey in the interview.
Which you did, which you ended up doing very publicly.
I did. I made the decision to speak about it on Kol Nidre, which is the evening of Yom Kippur. It can be described as the holiest service, certainly one of the holiest services in the Jewish tradition. Abdullah, you've been with our congregation.
It's like a Jewish Super Bowl. It's one night that you
without the chicken wings.
Right. Everybody shows up. As I think there were a number of things. I chose to do that very publicly because I felt it was something. I did that with the permission of the couple that had asked me. But I felt that it was something that doesn't just affect the lives of gay couples, of people who are in the LGBTQ community, but really affected the community as a whole. And I felt that it was very holy and sacred and very important to have that conversation specifically on that evening. I want to just sort of talk a little bit about what were some of the things that I had to overcome, or the struggles that I had. The first,
as you do that, Daniel, I think it might be slightly helpful to our students who are not very familiar with the particular denomination that you belong to. What are some of the limitations and theological and legal, religious normative struggles or limitations that prevented you saying, yes, I will do it right at the beginning in the first place?
Right, thank you. So I'm a conservative rabbi. Conservative rabbis they bring an orientation to Judaism that I would say errs on the side of precedent. In other words, we have an inherited tradition that goes back 2,000 years. And actually, the name conservative Judaism comes from this idea that we conserve the tradition when possible, and that we, now Orthodoxy takes I would say a more rigid approach to Jewish law in resisting almost all types of change. And Reform Judaism, part of the reform of Judaism for which Reform Judaism is named, is that it more quickly sets aside precedent and leaves decisions up to individuals, individual rabbis, to sort of think through. But then if people have thought it through for themselves, then that's sort of enough. And in the conservative movement, part of the way in which you make decisions as a rabbi is by consulting the Jewish tradition and also by being part of a movement of people who determine what's called the halakha, who determine Jewish law. And so, the conservative movement moved more slowly than certainly than Reform Judaism, as most religions until the 20th century, rejected homosexual behavior. That was sort of part of the history of religion and really humanity, unfortunately. And as our understandings of homosexuality started to change, different religious movements, both within Christianity and within Judaism, and Abdullah, you can talk about Islam, but started to wrestle with those questions in different ways. And the conservative movement was in a strange place, honestly, when I interviewed, because they had issued a tshuva, a responsum, permitting rabbis to perform gay marriages and permitting the acceptance of gays and lesbians, openly gay, people who are openly gay and lesbian, to rabbinical school, but had not yet provided the structure for how such a wedding was to be conducted. Mm-hmm. And so I was in this place of, of feeling like the permission had been given, but no guidance in terms of how to do that. And I was, I had expressed my concerns with the leadership of the movement, and I sort of came in, again, not having confronted that yet, and in a more conservative place, just in the sense of being tentative of, if this is something that I do, how do I do this? The other piece, which I want to say, because you're thinking about, how do you change your mind? So my father passed away about 4 years ago. His memory is a blessing, and he taught me many things. But he was 93 when he passed away. And like many people of his generation, his views on homosexuality were not something that I'm proud of. I love him, but he was not somebody who understood people who are gay and lesbian, and was able to I think see that humanity, or somebody with whom he had sort of been had a real friendship with. And I think that, if I'm honest with myself, it certainly wasn't the only reason, for my hesitance, but I think that, part of that, we would have very, very excited conversations, really arguments about, because I found so many of his views to be abhorrent, and there was some yelling and screaming and all of those things. And yet to sort of publicly embrace that as part of my own rabbinate, was a challenge. And I think it did inform, informed some of my, some of my thinking as well. But ultimately, what I want to say in terms of how I changed my mind is a couple of things. Number one, I had a good friend who continued to talk with me about it. And who loved and respected me for who I was and what my decision was, but also was able to talk to me about the importance of it to the community that we are a part of. I think also, my father during that point in his life was living in California. We were not yet Zooming. And there was a certain distance that for me meant that was a decision that I felt like I could make, and it would not sort of be in his face or something that was going to directly create conflict or dishonor in terms of our relationship. I also made my peace with, if that dishonor was there, I was going to be okay with it, because I knew that my responsibility lay not just to him, but was far greater than that as a religious leader. But the most important thing was that there were people in my community who I loved, and who came to me and they asked. And to say no was ultimately was to mean that what I was saying to them is that there was no way for me to be their religious leader and to sanction the love that they had for each other. And being face to face and knowing these people who I care about and who I love very much, that was not something that I was willing to say in that sort of personal moment. And from that, the sources fell into place, and the talk that I gave fell into place. But I think it was really it was that personal relationship that ended up making the biggest difference.
We've been having these conversations, heart and mind, and one of the consistent theme is our relationship with our parents, our relationship with, and in so many ways, they play a positive and negative role in changing one's heart. The kind of unnamed contracts we built with our parents, and the way they keep influencing our lives. Can you say a little bit more? Was there any element of maybe inheriting your father's views on homosexuality also playing while you work through your hesitation? How that relationship, complicated relationship, affected your change of heart in that sense?
So I think it's a great question. And the other piece which I would add is that, there's a way in which our relationship with our parents informs how we see ourselves. And in some ways, sort of how our image of ourselves, I think is, that's our ego. And so I think it's very deeply informed by those relationships. I think that, growing up with a father with views like that, I disagreed with them sort of fundamentally. There was something that I found very, very difficult in them. And, and yet I think I was isolated from people who were openly gay, when I was in college and for some time. And I wonder if that sort of isolation, to what extent did my father, did those conversations sort of inform how I was carrying myself with, was I putting out there a vibe, right? God forbid, into the world that signaled to some people, I'm not a safe person. It like makes me ashamed, to think about that. But I have to understand, maybe that was a possibility, right? And that in some ways people who were gay and lesbian were an abstraction to me, that I was sort of fighting through this lens that had been, put over my eyes that I even knew was there. But there was a lot of, scratching and clawing that had to happen. And I think that's, I think I needed to be honest with myself about that, and create, actively create that distance, so that I could have, real relationships and could see more clearly.
I remember when you gave that talk, thinking, "Wow, that's brave," and in the best sense. And in the conversations that Abdullah and I have had over the last 2 weeks, as he said, the parental constraints on either propelling change or constraining change are really profound. And for some, they've had to wait for their parents to move on, to pass, and then we're freed to do something. You didn't do that, and it makes me wonder not only about your relationship with your father after this change of heart, but what did this public announcement do in terms of people you lost and people you gained. We find in change that some people come along and some don't. And I just wonder what impact it had after.
So it's possible that I continue to be blind to people who we lost. Okay. But my sense is that I don't think we lost anybody. And Eric, you were there. It was a very strange thing for me as a rabbi, because when I sort of gave people my answer, there was someone who stood up and started to clap. And then the community, the entire community sort of gave a standing ovation. And I say it's strange, and I think like I'm even holding my hands here, because as a rabbi, like I'm not giving sermons to like get everybody's adulation and applause. And there's a piece of me that's like very uncomfortable with that sort of attention on me. And what I tried to do in that moment was really just to close my eyes and to understand that that's not about me, right? That's about the Torah, and it's about something much larger than myself. And I think that it was a decision that that the community needed ultimately to heal and ultimately to be whole, and not only whole with each other, but to know, there's something. It is a very, very deep question, right? Because if the answer to that, and I'm not diminishing people who have different answers, but for me, up until that point, I think that the Torah, which Jews sort of understand to be God's will, right? Like what's supposed to be right in the world, okay, was in conflict, what was diminished, because the Torah was fundamentally saying to people who were gay and lesbian that you are less than, or that your love has no place here. And so I really experienced that as a moment of what the Jewish tradition calls tikkun, of repair, which was a little bit for me about repairing my relationship with the community and apologizing for the sort of clumsy way in which I answered and the people who were hurt in the interview process. But I think also ultimately it was about helping the community to feel closer, to say this tradition, which is supposed to be my guiding light and point me towards what's right in the world. Yes, right. It's much closer to that. There may be people. There may be people who were lost, and I think
What about your dad?
I didn't send my dad an email with a recording of the sermon or a copy of the sermon and say, F off, sorry, that may be a little spicy, but
here's a pride flack in your face.
Yeah, no, like I didn't make the decision, and I didn't make the decision ultimately not to do it or to do it because of him. I think there's a way in which sometimes people live their lives in response to their parents by obeying, and sometimes people disobey, but they're still just living their lives in response to their parents, right? Because they're disobeying out of rebellion, right, and whatever. And I think what I tried to come to a place of saying was, Daniel, who are you? Who are you? What is your Torah? Who are you as a rabbi? Who are you as a teacher, as a Jew? And what are you willing to take, sort of willing to pay the price for when standing before God in the community? And ultimately, if there were people who we lost, I think I was okay. I wasn't throwing it in the community's face. I wasn't saying, and if you don't agree with this, you have no place here, or you're unwelcome, or you're immoral, or you're not Jewish, or anything like that. I was just saying, this is our decision for our community, and I want everybody, to be aware of that. And if that was sort of so distasteful to you that you had to leave the community, the truth is I had made my peace with, and I still am at peace with, okay, I get it. I get it. And unfortunately, this can't be a Jewish home for you, but I'm not going to not do that in order to keep you in.
This might be a slightly hypothetical question, but I'm going to give it a try. I'm so glad you didn't pay a huge cost of your change of heart. I'm so glad the external environment, personally and professionally, wasn't hostile to this change. But I wonder if it wasn't the case, if you would have still moved ahead with this. If you were an Orthodox rabbi, or if you were facing this 15, 20 years ago. And if you knew what you know now then, would you swim against the current and push this change of heart into a reality? I don't know if you ever thought about this.
No, I've thought about it a lot. A lot. And I think, let me answer in two ways, because I'm a rabbi, and you should, all of you Duke undergrads know that when you, the saying is 2 rabbis, 3 opinions. So on the one hand, I'm aging myself. I love the series, The West Wing. And there's a scene, if you know it really well, like I do, where this Vice President Bob Russell, named Bingo Bob, who he sort of is a nobody from nowhere, and he gets brought in because it's who the Republicans will approve to be the vice president. And he comes to Leo because the president has ended the negotiations about the budget agreement. And he's trying to tell Leo, who's the president's chief of staff, he has to keep negotiating, right? The president is, and he says to Leo McGarry, he says, do you know what they call a leader with no following? And Leo says, what? And he says, it's just a guy out for a walk. Okay. And it's a great line, right? Because, Abdullah, I think that there is a principled way to say, if I'm going to be a leader, I can't swim against the stream so much that I'm just a guy out for a walk. Okay. Now, it's part of what I believe leadership is about hanging in there with your people. Okay. And not just sort of, going out for a walk and leaving them behind. So I think that there's actually a principled reason to not only swim against the stream, and sometimes you have to be willing to pay a price. And you have to be willing to swim upstream. And I can only say that I hope that I would have the courage to do that. You and I love each other, so I'll just tell you like another, piece. Sometimes in our community, we Abdullah and I do a lot of work on Israel. Israel is a very, very controversial subject, in the American Jewish community and in our community. And sometimes the thing to make everybody happy would be to say nothing at all. Because people sort of want that divorce between religion and what they understand to be politics, and the truth is that there are times I'm not willing to pay that price, and sometimes I swim against the current because I see part of my role as a teacher to challenge people, not with my political opinions, but to wrestle and to make that a little less comfortable. So I think. You don't want to be a guy out for the walk, but on the other hand, if you're just, holding up your finger and figuring out which way the wind blows, then that's a problem too. And I can only say I wrestle with that, and I always try to challenge myself.
Absolutely. That's a beautiful analogy. Maybe a small distinction is it takes a village to collectively, individually change. Sometimes you need those crazy folks walking alone, the Harvey Milks of 1970s, and those lonely walkers of people suffered through HIV pandemics. Nobody followed them. There's a biblical and Quranic picture of Abraham is on one side of the river and everybody else is on the other side of the river. But you need some people holding on to this lonely life on the other side of the river. At some point, humanity will get there. But unless these people take sacrifice and walk alone for a while and create a reality, that change of heart that needs to go in that direction doesn't generate on its own. I would never, you're not suggesting that, but I would never underestimate those lonely walkers of our sages.
Yeah.
Who pushed us in the direction that we need to go. Sometimes they had to go far to show us which direction we need to go.
So just in the spirit of shared dialogue, so the word Hebrew, right, comes from Ivri, and Ivri means Abraham was the first person in the Torah called Ivri because he came from the other side of the Euphrates. He came from the other, and he came to Israel, and he said, "Oh, he's one of those people from over there," right? And so there is a great sense in which part of what it means to be Jewish in the world is to actually be willing to be countercultural and to be other and to challenge assumptions. And I think for leaders, what I'll share with you, I want to bring another person just into the conversation. We lost in our community a true mensch and an extraordinary human being named Charlie Vanderhorst. Charlie was a physician at UNC who was a hero during the AIDS crisis in caring for people in the gay community, and he was a warrior standing alongside Bishop or Reverend Barber in the fight for healthcare in North Carolina, and he was arrested in Raleigh at the City Hall, and Charlie was for me, he was and Charlie knew I wasn't out there on the picket lines with him. It's not the way that I walk through the world. And Charlie didn't hate me for that. And he didn't criticize me for that. And he didn't make me feel less for that. And we would talk, and he lived in my ear and in my heart and continues to live in my ear and my heart as that person who is pushing, right? And saying, and sort of, pushing me to say, Daniel, okay, but what does your faith mean to the world, right? And okay, religion needs to be a sanctuary. Abraham Joshua Heschel famously said, religion should comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Okay, it's a great saying. So our religion should be a sanctuary. It should be a place where people can go and everybody can feel welcome and be shielded from this poisonous world of divisive politics that is all around us. And yet, if we shield ourselves totally, then what's our faith about? Right? And hey, it makes it very hard to read the Bible, right? And to say we have nothing to say when people are starving on the streets, and we have nothing to say when we have a community where people are homeless and don't have health care. And I think as leaders, there's such a gift in having people ask you those questions, but do so in a way that's not angry and that doesn't erase the humanity of the leader who's standing before you, but does it from a place of love and of commitment to continuing being in the relationship. I miss Charlie very much.
I'm sure. It might be a missed opportunity if we don't ask you, Daniel. We are nearing towards the end of our conversation. You led a sizable congregation over this pandemic. Has this pandemic, we are asking this to every person we interview, has this pandemic experience with all its good, bad, and ugly changed your heart and mind about anything? Have you gained a very radically different shift in some of the pre-pandemic life or principles that you had?
So I'm going to pick something that from the outside will feel very small, okay? But if you had said to me a year ago, as a rabbi, we're going to have a Zoom set up in the sanctuary on Shabbat, I would have looked at you like you were crazy, okay? The use of electronics, the conservative movement sort of teases that out. But for me, a year ago, I'm going to tell you, Shabbat is this day of rest and freedom from the rest of the world. And this iPhone is Shabbat kryptonite, okay? Because that to me is like the, social media and emails and computers take me out of Shabbat, right? If they're part of this 6 days of the week, you are engaged in all the businessness and the noise and the chatter. And for me, Shabbat was like, let it go, right? And I would revel in the opportunity to walk into the building on Shabbat, to this place sort of free of that, and to have this experience that I miss so much of face-to-face, seeing each other, singing together, being present with the person who's right there in front of you. And I'm not saying that I'm not going back to that. I miss it, and I look forward to going back to that. But I have seen, I'll give you an example. Unfortunately, we've done many funerals during the pandemic. And at these funerals, after a funeral, there's a Shiva, which is a service that's held at the home of people who are in mourning. And we now do these over Zoom. And there are people who show up over Zoom who could never come to the funeral because they live too far away. We do services on Shabbat over Zoom, and there are people who show up who can't show up because they're physically disabled. But now, because we're using Zoom, the synagogue is more accessible in ways that express our values, right? That everybody should have a way to connect. And so it has challenged me to say, on the one hand, how do I preserve that sense of Shabbat, which I think is authentic in the sources and which is so precious to me, of being free of the electronic devices and sort of so that we can be present with each other. But I now see who are the people, if you're only making Shabbat and you're doing it without this technology and you're only doing it in your physical space, who are you leaving out? Right? Who are you excluding? You have to pay attention to who you're excluding and what does that mean? Right?
The crazy thing is, of course, the pandemic didn't invent Zoom. We all could have been doing this last year, but none of us thought of it in our teaching and I have more students coming to office hours than they've ever had because they don't have to take the bus from West Campus to East Campus.
That's right.
None of us thought of it. Think about the things we don't think of that this pandemic has made us think about. And of course, we have to admit that God has a great sense of humor, that Bethel invested $5 million in the most beautiful sanctuary that I've ever seen, and we can't use it. That's a great sense of humor.
Well, it's sense of humor, but in a very deep way, it's allowing ourselves to, we deceive ourselves into thinking that we are in charge and that we know what's good for us and that we have all the answers. And I think the first thing that faith in God should come with is the corollary, which is that you are not, right? In other words, I believe in God and I know that I'm not God. And therefore, right, always walking through the world with a sense of what do I need to learn, right? What am I being taught by what's happening to me, right? And yeah, we were blind, right? We were blind to this tool which was there, and so now what I don't want to do is to just go back to saying, "Phew, we're done." Right? I can't act the same way, right? I actually need to allow myself to be changed, and I need to I need to be bothered, right? Abdullah, I love this idea, right? That there are these people who bother you, right? They ask you these difficult questions. Why don't you do that? And being able to see those questions as gifts, and to, instead of being defensive and protecting our egos, to breathe and to open ourselves up and to think, okay, what can I learn? Even if I'm not forgetting myself, right? I don't think it means I need to forget myself totally. But
well, I am so excited and humbled by think about this for a moment, of how much we are currently blind to, right? Like that we can't, and we're going to need another disruption to open our eyes to, and we'll say, why didn't we think of that? Let's commit ourselves together to thinking of that, whatever that is.
Right.
It's so exciting.
And I think about, to come back to my big decision, I don't want to go back to a world where I was blind to the humanity of people who are gay and lesbian and bisexual and queer and LGBTQ community. I don't want to go back to a world of blindness. Is it painful, to go through a change, you squint your eyes because all of a sudden there's this thing that, you're seeing what you didn't. Yeah, that's hard. And I, in no way, I'm not reading the tea leaves and saying, oh, God means, God did all of killed 3,000 people a day so that we can figure out how to use Zoom. No, that's an abhorrent idea. Okay. But when I am challenged in these moments, I think that being able to not just be defensive, but to breathe and to remain open, ultimately is a blessing.
As we arrive to the end of this delightful conversation, which we could go on for another hour, I just want to make sure our students, Rabbi Greyber used a few Yiddish words that you may not know. The most important one is, and some acronyms, is mensch, when you were talking about Charlie. It is like one of those Yiddish words. It could mean many things. It's like a bundle of joy, cute, cool, gracious, nice people who sees the best in everything, if that's a good summary of mensch. And he used a couple of acronyms that you may not have heard, like UNC. It refers to an insignificant university not too far from our campus, which we always respond to another acronym, GTHC. So one change of heart, which you have to go through hopefully one day, and swim against the current, is to convert to the right side of the blue and enlighten these infidels who are still cheering for the wrong tone. Thank you, my friend. This was wonderful.
Abdullah, I feel like you're trying to convert me. I thought that was like,
these Muslim imams, they never stop.
They never stop, man.
So wonderful. Happy Hanukkah. May the light shine brightly tonight.
Amen. Amen.
8 days for you and your family.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
And may you continue to thrive with your wonderful community. Looking forward to attending more than half of your shul and keep learning from you and your scholarship. Thank you so much.
Me too. Abdullah, you have to increase my, you've got so much Yiddish and Hebrew words. And I've got some, Yalla and Salam, and I have a few others. If I'm in Israel for a while, like they come back to me, but you got to help me, right? You're playing at a very high level.
I am at your service. Looking
All I would say for that is inshallah.
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 All right. You guys take care. Love you. Stay safe.
Yeah.